"You are not getting in, my brother," Julian whispered. He shoved his gold-embossed VIP pass inches from my face. The heavy cardstock caught the light of the White House security checkpoint. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply bypassed him, walked up to the protocol hostess, and placed my phone screen under her scanner. A sharp beep cut through the humid Washington air. The hostess stared at her monitor. Her skin went pale. She touched her earpiece and whispered to her superior that I had arrived. A moment later, a motorcade of black SUVs rolled to a stop right behind us. The doors opened, and the woman who stepped out was someone Julian used to mock as my sad and elderly landlady. Except tonight she was flanked by federal agents, and the four-star admiral waiting at the gate had just snapped into a crisp salute. "My name is Chloe. I am 34 years old. For over a decade I lived in the shadow of my older brother. Julian was the golden child, a flashy corporate lobbyist who loved reminding our parents of his six-figure salary. I was the quiet disappointment who rented a basement and worked an undisclosed government job. Before I show you how Julian shattered his own illusion of power, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever let a toxic relative talk while you quietly held the winning hand. The evening air was thick as we stood outside the fortified iron gates on Pennsylvania Avenue. Julian wore a midnight blue tuxedo. He vibrated with self-importance, dropping names of senators to anyone in the security line who would listen. His wife Naya stood a few paces behind him, a brilliant African-American former financial auditor who had sacrificed her own career to support his ambitions. She kept her gaze fixed on the pavement. She looked exhausted. Julian thrived on making sure everyone knew their place. When he spotted me standing near the back of the queue in a simple tailored suit, his smile vanished. He broke out of line, marching over to block my path. He looked me up and down with genuine pity. He told me this was a restricted reception for actual policymakers, not a public museum tour. He advised me to go back to my cramped basement apartment before I embarrassed the family. He assumed I had followed him to the Capitol, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elite. My silence only fueled his ego. He turned to Nia, joking about how I was always looking for a handout. I stepped around him and presented my screen to the head hostess. The digital reader flashed a crimson top-tier security authorization. The hostess trembled. She ignored Julian and signaled the heavy gates to open. Julian laughed, thinking I had downloaded a fake ticket. He demanded security remove me. Instead, the crowd parted. The motorcade idled at the curb. Beatrice Sterling stepped out of the lead vehicle. Julian recognized her immediately as the woman I rented my basement from. He used to joke about her worn-out sweaters and overgrown garden. Tonight she wore a sharp charcoal suit. 6 undercover agents formed a perimeter around her. Admiral Thomas approached the gate. He bypassed the corporate guests, bypassed Julian, and stood directly in front of Beatrice and me. He saluted Beatrice first, then turned his attention to me. He called me director, his voice echoing over the quiet crowd. He announced that the Secretary of Defense was waiting for my briefing in the West Wing. Julian froze. His mouth fell open. He looked at his meaningless corporate sponsor pass, then back at me. He tried to speak, but the Secret Service detail physically pushed him back behind the blue line to wait his turn. I walked through the iron gates without giving him a second glance. My focus was already shifting. As I crossed the lawn, my encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. A secure alert illuminated the screen. It was an intelligence intercept regarding Julian. He had just forged our parents' signatures to mortgage their retirement fund to a shadow lending syndicate. Beatrice Sterling did not look like the frail, forgetful woman Julian mocked every holiday season. For years, my brother treated my living arrangement as a punchline. During family dinners, he would ask if I was still fetching groceries for the elderly widow in exchange for reduced rent. Last Thanksgiving, he even pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his wallet and told me to give it to my landlady so she could buy better yarn for her hideous cardigans. I never corrected his assumptions. I preferred letting him construct his own reality. Tonight, Beatrice shattered that reality without speaking a single word. She stepped onto the pavement wearing a sharp charcoal-tailored suit that projected undeniable authority. The 6 men surrounding her were not private bodyguards. They wore the subtle earpieces and rigid posture of federal agents. Beatrice was the former director of cyber intelligence and the current billionaire founder of Sterling Cybernetics. She held defense contracts that dictated national security policies. Julian stood frozen on the walkway. His eyes darted from Beatrice to the armored vehicles and back to the agents securing our perimeter. His brain struggled to process the visual information. He recognized her face, but the context destroyed everything he thought he knew about wealth and influence. He still clutched his gold-embossed ticket, but his knuckles had turned white. Admiral Thomas, a man with 3 rows of commendations on his chest, stepped forward. He bypassed the entire queue of eager corporate executives and stopped directly in front of Beatrice. He snapped into a rigid textbook salute. "It is an honor to have you here tonight, ma'am," the Admiral said, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. Beatrice offered a slight, respectful nod. She turned her gaze toward me. Admiral Thomas followed her lead. He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask for a ticket. He simply lowered his head in a gesture of profound professional respect. "Director Chloe," he said, "the Department of Defense team has assembled in the West Wing. The Secretary is eagerly awaiting your vulnerability report." Julian made a sound that resembled a choke. The carefully crafted persona he wore for his lobbying clients evaporated in an instant. "Director," he stammered, stepping forward. His voice cracked high and desperate. "Her, you mean her. She rents a basement. She does low-level IT support." He thrust his VIP pass toward the Admiral, treating the piece of paper like a shield against the unfolding truth. "I have a sponsor package," Julian insisted, his tone frantic. "I am a senior vice president. There has to be a mistake with your registry." Admiral Thomas did not even blink. He looked at Julian the way one might look at a discarded wrapper on a clean sidewalk. A Secret Service agent immediately stepped between Julian and our group. The agent raised a flat-gloved hand, pressing it firmly against Julian's chest. "Step back behind the blue line, sir," the agent commanded. The tone left no room for negotiation. Julian tried to argue, pointing at me with a trembling finger, but 2 more uniformed officers converged on his position. They instructed him that his general access credentials required a secondary manual verification. They corralled him away from the main entrance, pushing him back into the crowded holding pen with the rest of the standard attendees. Nia watched the scene unfold with wide, calculating eyes. She did not rush to defend her husband. Instead, she stared at me, processing the gravity of what she had just witnessed. I did not offer Julian a smug smile. I did not wave goodbye or utter a single sarcastic remark. Gloating is a tool for the insecure. I simply adjusted the lapel of my jacket and walked through the reinforced iron gates alongside Beatrice and the Admiral. The heavy metal doors closed behind us, cutting off the noise of the street and leaving Julian stranded on the outside. We entered the grand foyer of the executive mansion. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and fresh floral arrangements. Marble floors echoed under our shoes. Men and women in formal wear mingled near the reception halls, holding crystal glasses and speaking in measured, careful tones. This was the epicenter of global power, and I belonged here. Beatrice walked beside me, her expression unreadable. She did not mention Julian. We operated in a world where loud, arrogant men were common and easily dismissed. Our focus was on the upcoming briefing. But as we approached the security corridor leading to the West Wing, my encrypted device vibrated against my side. It was a direct intercept routed through the Sterling Cybernetics internal threat matrix. My clearance allowed me to monitor specific financial anomalies, a system I had quietly programmed to track the vulnerabilities in our own family trust. I pulled the device from my pocket and unlocked the screen. The message was highly classified, intercepted just moments ago by a financial watchdog algorithm. Julian had not merely maxed out his credit lines to sustain his lavish lifestyle. The data scrolling across my screen detailed a calculated fraudulent maneuver. He had accessed our parents' secure retirement accounts. Using digital manipulation and forged signatures, he had leveraged their entire life savings. Furthermore, the documents showed he had put a secondary mortgage on their property, effectively tying the home they had owned for 30 years to a shadow lending syndicate known for ruthless collection tactics. I stopped walking. The soft glow of the screen illuminated the cold facts. Julian was desperate. His lobbying firm was failing, and he was hemorrhaging money trying to maintain the facade of a Washington elite. To fund his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his empty VIP passes, he had secretly signed our parents over to financial ruin. Beatrice paused a few steps ahead. She turned back, noticing the shift in my posture. Her sharp eyes analyzed my face. She did not ask if I was all right. She knew me too well for that. "What is the situation?" she asked, her voice low and steady. I locked the device and slid it back into my pocket. The image of Julian standing outside the gate, puffing his chest out in a fake display of dominance, flashed through my mind. He thought he was untouchable. He believed his web of lies would hold forever. "Julian has crossed a fatal line," I said. "He just handed over my parents' assets to clear his own debts." Beatrice nodded slowly. The expression on her face was not sympathetic. It was tactical. She understood the mechanics of dismantling a threat. "Handle the briefing first," she instructed, turning toward the heavy oak doors of the Situation Room. "Then we dismantle his infrastructure." I took a deep breath of the chilled, conditioned air. Julian had spent a lifetime treating me like a stepping stone, a useless object he could step on to elevate himself. He had underestimated my intelligence, mocked my career, and dismissed my worth. But stealing from our parents to feed his unchecked ego was an error he could not reverse. I stepped forward, matching Beatrice's pace. The game had shifted. I was no longer just the quiet sister waiting in the shadows. I was the architect of his impending downfall, and he had just handed me the blueprints. As we concluded the briefing in the West Wing, providing the Defense Secretary with our updated cyber threat assessments, my mind compartmentalized the incoming crisis. Julian's fraud was a ticking clock. I needed more data, and I needed an insider to verify the extent of the damage. My thoughts drifted to Nia. The look on her face at the security checkpoint kept replaying in my mind. She was a brilliant auditor who had given up her career. She was too smart not to notice the cracks in Julian's financial facade. If Julian was drowning in debt, Nia would eventually feel the impact, or perhaps she already suspected the rot beneath the surface. The official proceedings wrapped up an hour later. The secretary thanked us, and the heavy doors opened, allowing us to transition from the sterile environment of national security into the opulent glow of the evening gala. The main reception room was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. String music floated over the quiet hum of strategic networking. I scanned the room. The seating arrangements at these events were a physical manifestation of influence. The central tables, adorned with towering floral centerpieces and silver service, were reserved for key policymakers, intelligence directors, and high-ranking officials. The peripheral tables pushed toward the service doors and shadowed corners were designated for general admission sponsors, the mid-tier attendees who paid for the privilege of breathing the same air as the decision-makers. I took my seat at table 1 directly across from the Senate Majority Leader. I waited patiently, watching the main entrance. It was time to see exactly where Julian's expensive, meaningless VIP pass had landed him in the hierarchy of the room. The doors opened, and the general admission guests began to filter inside. Julian entered, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room to find a target for his rehearsed charm. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The layout of the grand ballroom reflected a brutal and unspoken hierarchy. At the epicenter, beneath a cascading crystal chandelier, sat Table 1. I occupied the seat to the immediate right of the Senate Majority Leader, directly across from Admiral Thomas. We were engaged in a low, measured conversation about securing domestic power grids against foreign state actors. Servers wearing white gloves poured vintage wine with silent precision. The atmosphere at our table was heavy with actual influence. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. From my vantage point, I had a clear line of sight to the main entrance. Julian walked through the arched double doors a few minutes after the opening remarks. He adjusted his silk lapels, his chin tilted upward, scanning the room for his designated place among the elite. He waited for a senior protocol officer to guide him forward. Instead, a junior hostess checked his generic sponsor credential. She offered a polite practice smile and pointed toward the far wall. Julian led Nia through the maze of tables. His confident stride faltered as they walked further and further away from the center of the room. They bypassed the cabinet members. They bypassed the corporate CEOs. They kept walking until they reached Table 42. It was situated in a dim corner, wedged uncomfortably close to the swinging kitchen doors. The ambient noise of clattering dishware and shouting chefs bled through the wood every time a waiter passed. Their table mates were low-level administrative aides and junior public relations staff. I watched Julian pull out a chair for his wife. His face was rigid with contained fury. He had spent weeks bragging on social media about his exclusive White House invitation, painting himself as an indispensable political insider. Now he was sitting in the shadows eating a catered dinner next to a service station. He glared across the room and locked eyes with me. I did not offer a sympathetic nod. I simply raised my water glass, took a slow sip, and returned my attention to the senator outlining a new defense budget. The humiliation gnawed at my brother. Julian possessed a fragile ego that demanded constant validation. Being relegated to the background was a physical torment for him. He needed to reassert his dominance to prove to the room and to himself that he was a man of substance. His opportunity arrived between the second and third courses. The event organizers initiated a silent charity auction to fund a veteran housing initiative. As the bids transitioned from silent paper pledges to a live vocal auction for a select few premium items, the room grew quiet. The auctioneer presented a contemporary landscape painting. The opening bid started at $10,000. A few polite paddles went up from the mid-tier tables. Julian saw his opening. He did not wait for the natural rhythm of the auction. He stood up from his chair in the dark corner, raising his numbered paddle high in the air, and shouted out a bid of $50,000. The sheer volume of his voice disrupted the sophisticated hum of the room. Several guests turned in their seats to locate the source of the disruption. The senator sitting across from me paused his sentence, raising a single gray eyebrow at the sudden outburst. Julian stood tall, puffing out his chest. He looked away from the auctioneer and stared directly at me across the vast expanse of the ballroom. It was a juvenile, transparent challenge. He was trying to buy the status he had been denied at the gate. The auctioneer gladly accepted the inflated bid, and the gavel struck the podium. Julian sat down, flashing a triumphant smile at Nia. He adjusted his cuffs, soaking in the brief manufactured spotlight. 10 minutes later, a discreet event coordinator approached Julian in the shadows. She carried a sleek wireless payment terminal on a silver tray. Standard protocol dictated that high-value charity pledges were secured immediately. Julian leaned back, producing a heavy, dark metal credit card with practiced flair. He dropped it onto the tray, making sure the junior aides at his table noticed the premium weight of the metal. The coordinator inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine processed the request for a few seconds. A sharp synthetic tone rejected the transaction. The screen glowed red. The coordinator maintained her polite smile. She quietly informed him that the card had been declined and asked if he would prefer to use an alternate method of payment. Julian let out a scoff of disbelief. He blamed the wireless connection in the historic building. He snatched the card, wiped the chip on his napkin, and shoved it back into the terminal himself. The machine beeped again. Denied. Insufficient funds. Julian felt the eyes of his tablemates burning into him. His neck flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. He dug into his jacket pocket, pulling out a secondary corporate card. He swiped it through the reader. The terminal emitted the same harsh, unforgiving rejection tone. The event coordinator took a step back, her professional smile thinning into a mask of awkward pity. She whispered that perhaps he needed to contact his financial institution and that she would return later. Nia sat motionless beside him. 5 years ago, before Julian convinced her that his rising empire required a traditional supportive wife at home, Nia had been a senior financial auditor for a ruthless corporate accounting firm. She possessed an analytical mind built for tracing discrepancies, locating hidden debts, and identifying systemic fraud. She knew the precise difference between a bank error and a hard asset freeze. She watched her husband sweat. She saw the tremor in his fingers as he shoved the useless plastic back into his wallet. The narrative Julian had fed her for years about his boundless success fractured in that dim corner. The lavish vacations, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, all of it suddenly looked like a hollow theater production. Nia stood up from the table. She did not say a word to Julian. She slung her evening purse over her shoulder and walked briskly toward the corridor, blending into the flow of guests heading toward the restrooms. Once she hit the cold marble of the hallway, she pulled out her phone. She bypassed Julian entirely and dialed the direct line to their private wealth manager. I observed her departure from the center of the room. My defensive instincts sharpened. A declined card could be a simple overextension of credit, but Julian hacking into our parents' retirement funds earlier that evening indicated a much deeper, more volatile financial crisis. In the corridor, Nia answered the stringent security questions required to access their joint profiles. The bank representative on the line sounded tense. He informed her that the accounts were not experiencing a technical glitch. They were locked. Every single line of credit, every checking account, and every corporate expense file tied to Julian's name had been frozen by federal mandate. When Nia asked for the specific reason, the representative cited suspicious structuring and international wire transfers that triggered an automatic hold under the Bank Secrecy Act. Nia ended the call. The marble walls of the hallway felt like they were closing in on her. She had abandoned a thriving auditing career to build a life with a man who was actively destroying her future. She knew the legal implications of suspicious structuring. If the federal government was freezing accounts, Julian was not just broke. He was facing federal indictment, and as his legal spouse, her name was tethered to the wreckage. She needed an ally. She needed someone who understood how to navigate government surveillance and digital footprints. Nia returned to the ballroom. She did not walk back to the shadowed table near the kitchen. She navigated through the maze of guests, her eyes locked on my position. She moved with a rigid mechanical precision, ignoring the protocol officers who tried to redirect her path. She reached table 1. Admiral Thomas paused mid-sentence, noting her sudden arrival. I held up a hand, signaling to the table that the interruption was permitted. Nia leaned down, placing her hands flat on the edge of the table. Her face was devoid of color. The elegant facade she had maintained all evening had melted away, leaving raw, unfiltered terror. She pretended to lean in for a standard family greeting, pressing her cheek near mine to avoid drawing unnecessary attention from the surrounding politicians. As she pulled back, she slid a small folded piece of paper into the palm of my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Chloe, I need your help," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly I could barely catch the syllables over the string music. "Julian is not just bankrupt. I ran the codes. He is laundering money." The small folded piece of paper burned against my palm. I slipped it into my pocket without breaking eye contact with the Admiral. Nia backed away from the table, her composure fracturing with every step as she retreated to the service corner. I waited until the gala concluded, maintaining the quiet protocol of the evening. I did not confront Julian. I did not engage in public theater. I simply returned to my secure apartment, booted up my encrypted terminal, and unfolded the paper. It contained a single routing number and a complex sequence of alphanumeric codes tracing back to an offshore holding account. Nia had managed to extract the digital breadcrumbs before the bank fully purged her access. The next morning, the sterile hum of the Sterling cybernetic secure servers filled my basement office. Using my specialized clearance, I bypassed the standard firewalls and ran a deep trace on the routing number. The resulting data cascade revealed a financial labyrinth designed to obscure a singular, devastating truth. Julian had not simply made bad investments. He had orchestrated a sustained parasitic extraction of our family's assets. For 3 years, while he paraded around Washington in bespoke suits and leased luxury vehicles, Julian's lobbying firm had been hemorrhaging capital. To plug the leaks, he targeted the most vulnerable source available. I watched the digitized legal documents materialize on my monitor. My stomach tightened. Julian had systematically forged our parents' signatures. He had liquidated their entire retirement portfolio, a fund they had painstakingly built over 40 years of honest labor. But the theft extended further. He had placed a secondary high-yield mortgage on their historic log cabin, the property my grandfather had built by hand. He used their legacy as collateral to secure high-interest loans from a syndicate operating on the fringes of the legal financial system. The scale of his deception was chilling, but the psychological manipulation was far worse. I pulled up the internal communications stored on his unsecured cloud drive. Email threads and text logs showed a clear pattern of gaslighting. To secure total control over our parents' finances, Julian had spent years feeding them a narrative that I was a financially unstable, ungrateful daughter. He convinced them that I refused to contribute to their care, positioning himself as the loyal, burdened son who was single-handedly keeping the family afloat. He manufactured a crisis to justify holding the keys to their bank accounts, and then he drained them dry. At 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my childhood home. "Chloe," my father said, his voice clipped and strained. "Your mother and I need you at the house. Now. Julian is here. We have to discuss family matters." The trap was set. Julian was panicking after his public humiliation at the gala. He needed an infusion of cash, and he was using our parents to orchestrate an ambush. I arrived at their suburban home 30 minutes later. The manicured lawn and white picket fence stood in stark contrast to the financial rot decaying the foundation. I stepped through the front door. The living room felt heavy. My parents sat rigidly on the sofa, their faces drawn tight with anxiety. Julian stood in the center of the room, exuding a false air of weary responsibility. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as I crossed the threshold, he picked up a thick stack of medical bills from the coffee table and tossed them aggressively toward me. The papers scattered across the floor at my feet. "It is time you started pulling your weight," Chloe, Julian declared, his voice ringing with rehearsed indignation. "Mom needs a knee replacement, and Dad's cardiac medications are increasing. I cannot carry this family on my shoulders alone anymore. You need to stop leeching and start contributing." My parents looked down at the carpet. They had been conditioned to believe his narrative. They saw a successful son buckling under the weight of their care and a disappointing daughter who needed to be forced into responsibility. Julian stepped closer, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. He was demanding a transfer of $20,000 to cover expenses he had already squandered on bad debts. I did not flinch. I did not bend down to pick up the scattered papers. I looked past his aggressive posturing, maintaining a steady, unblinking gaze. "All right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I will handle the expenses." Julian let out a sharp, victorious breath. A smirk flickered across his face. He thought he had won. He believed his bullying had broken my resistance. He opened his mouth to deliver another lecture on family duty, fully prepared to twist the knife. Before he could utter a single word, a piercing, high-decibel alarm erupted from the dining room. Julian spun around. The source of the noise was his personal work laptop left open on the oak table. The screen flashed violently, cycling rapidly between stark white and critical red warnings. The sound was not a standard error notification. It was a localized perimeter breach alert. Julian scrambled toward the table, his confident stride dissolving into a frantic sprint. He slammed his fingers against the keyboard, trying to terminate the process. The screen locked. A massive official insignia materialized across the display. The stylized seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation dominated the monitor, accompanied by a scrolling text detailing an active real-time compliance audit. The FBI Cyber Division was actively sweeping his company's servers, extracting data packets related to offshore wire fraud and illegal lobbying contributions. The digital hounds had been released. Julian stared at the glaring federal insignia on his laptop. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. The piercing alarm continued to wail, a digital siren announcing the collapse of his carefully constructed empire. His hands, usually smooth and steady, when shaking hands with politicians, trembled violently as he slammed the laptop shut. He nearly cracked the hinges in his desperation to silence the noise. He spun back toward the living room, pasting a rigid, terrified smile onto his face. He offered a strained laugh to our parents, who were watching him with growing confusion. "Just a minor server glitch at the firm," he said, his voice an octave too high. "An aggressive malware update. Nothing to worry about. I have to handle this immediately." He didn't wait for their response. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising and desperate, and dragged me out of the living room. He pulled me through the kitchen and shoved me through the side door into the dim, dusty expanse of the garage. The air smelled of motor oil and damp concrete. Julian paced the length of the garage, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair until it stood on end. He was no longer the composed lobbyist. He was a cornered animal calculating his escape route. He stopped and turned to me, his eyes wide and frantic. "You do IT support, right? You fix networks for those government contractors," he demanded. It was not a question. It was a command. "I need you to wipe a hidden partition on my company server, tonight." His arrogance remained fully intact, even as his world imploded. He was asking me to commit a federal crime obstructing an active investigation, yet he spoke to me as if he were assigning a menial chore to an underling. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "I will pay you $5,000, he offered, pulling out his wallet as if he could produce the cash on the spot. $5,000, Chloe. That is more than you make in a month. Just run a scrubbing protocol and erase the offshore holding files. No one will ever know." He genuinely believed I was a struggling, desperate technician who could be bought with pocket change. He viewed my quiet life as a symptom of poverty, a weakness he could exploit. He had no concept of the reality that my division at the Department of Defense had authorized the very audit currently tearing through his network. My team had flagged his firm after tracing dark money originating from known hostile cyber espionage groups attempting to influence domestic policy. He was not just laundering money, he was a national security liability. I looked at his outstretched hand, then at the frantic desperation in his eyes. I did not lecture him on ethics. I did not reveal my position. I simply offered a tight, compliant smile. "I can handle the server, Julian," I said evenly. "I will access the partition tonight." Relief washed over him. His posture sagged, and the arrogant smirk crept back onto his face. He patted my shoulder, a gesture of hollow, patronizing affection. "Good girl," he murmured. "I knew you would finally make yourself useful. Send me a message when the drive is clean." He hurried back into the house, leaving me alone in the garage. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before returning to my apartment. The air was cool and crisp as night settled over the city. I bypassed my standard living area and descended into my secure workspace. I booted up my primary terminal. The multiple screens hummed to life, bathing the room in a cool blue glow. Julian had provided me with the access nodes required to infiltrate his hidden partition. He wanted me to act as his digital janitor. Instead, I operated as his executioner. I bypassed his rudimentary security protocols in under 3 minutes. I located the hidden drive containing the offshore holding files. Instead of initiating a scrubbing sequence, I deployed a customized extraction script. Line by line, ledger by ledger, I downloaded the entirety of his illegal transactions, his forged loan documents, and his communications with unregistered foreign agents. The data transfer ran quietly in the background. As the files cloned onto my secure encrypted drive, I executed the second phase of my operation. I altered the permissions on his company server. I stripped his administrative rights and locked the entire network into a read-only state. He would be able to view his impending ruin, but he would be entirely unable to delete, modify, or conceal a single kilobyte of data. The evidence was frozen in place, perfectly preserved for the federal investigators. The progress bar on my monitor hit 100%. The download was complete. The trap was permanently set. Just as I initiated the final lockdown protocol, a sharp buzz emanated from my perimeter security panel. The camera feed outside my front door flickered onto the secondary monitor. It was past midnight. The street was empty, save for a single figure standing on my porch. I zoomed in on the feed. The figure pulled a heavy coat tighter against the cold. It was Nia. She stood under the harsh glare of the security light, her face drawn and shadowed. She was clutching a large, tightly sealed cardboard document box against her chest. I disengaged the deadbolts and opened the door. She stepped out of the darkness and into my hallway, her eyes darting nervously back toward the street. Nia stepped over the threshold, bringing the biting chill of the midnight air into my apartment. She was trembling, though not from the cold. The elegant, subdued wife, Julian, paraded at political fundraisers, had vanished. In her place stood a razor-sharp former auditor operating on pure calculated adrenaline. She dropped the heavy cardboard box onto my glass coffee table with a muted thud. She did not wait for an invitation to speak. She unbuttoned her coat and pulled a sleek silver flash drive from an internal pocket. "I traced the offshore accounts," she said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "I spent the last 72 hours tearing apart his personal ledgers while he was busy putting out fires at the firm. I found the primary holding account in the Cayman Islands. The revelation hung in the quiet living room. Julian was not just laundering money. He was preparing an exit strategy." Nia's eyes locked onto mine. The fear I had seen at the gala had hardened into tactical resolve. She was a woman analyzing a hostile takeover of her own life. Julian is planning to liquidate everything. She continued, her tone clinical, despite the devastating context. He intends to wire the remaining capital overseas and vanish. He set up a series of shell companies and quietly transferred the massive tax liabilities to my name. When the IRS audits hit, I will be the one facing federal indictment for unpaid corporate taxes while he sits on a beach untouched. My brother's cruelty lacked any structural limit. He viewed his family, his wife, and his children as disposable assets, shields he could discard to protect his own skin. Nia had not come to my apartment seeking a shoulder to cry on. She had arrived to negotiate a mutual defense pact. She pointed to the flash drive. The box contains physical printouts of the fraudulent tax filings, she explained. The drive contains the encrypted passwords for his physical safe at the lobbying firm. I know you have the capability to dismantle him digitally. I need you to secure the legitimate trust funds established for my children before the federal freeze catches collateral damage. In exchange, I give you the final pieces of evidence to bury him permanently. The alliance was forged without hesitation. Our objectives aligned perfectly. I took the flash drive and walked over to my secure terminal. I bypassed the standard authorization protocols and accessed the raw data Nia had extracted. The numbers populating the screen functioned as an explicit execution order for Julian's career and freedom. The depth of his embezzlement was staggering, meticulously structured to leave Nia holding the empty, debt-ridden bag. We possessed the required ammunition. The next step involved a coordinated strike to isolate his remaining assets and sever his escape routes. We needed to map the exact timeline of his intended wire transfers. Before I could run the tracing algorithm, a harsh, flashing red notification hijacked the secondary monitor. My perimeter defense system had been triggered. I silenced the audible alarm, switching the video feed to full screen. A black, heavily tinted SUV had just mounted the curb outside my building. The vehicle bore no license plates. The engine idled, a low, menacing rumble, audible even through the reinforced glass of my windows. 3 men stepped out of the vehicle. They did not move like process servers or local law enforcement. They wore unmarked, dark tactical suits. Their posture was rigid, their movements synchronized and efficient. They fanned out, approaching my front entrance with aggressive intent. They were not here to ask questions. They were here to neutralize a threat. Julian's shadow lenders had grown impatient, and his attempt to utilize my IT skills had painted a target directly on my door. The men approaching the door were enforcers dispatched by the private syndicate Julian had foolishly entangled himself with. They were debt collectors operating outside the bounds of the law, sent to locate the man who had squandered their capital. Julian had likely pointed them toward my address, attempting to use me as a diversion while he scrambled for an exit. I did not panic. I engaged the reinforced deadbolts and motioned for Nia to grab the cardboard box. We moved with practiced silence, slipping through the concealed rear exit of my apartment that opened into a subterranean maintenance corridor. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, just as the unmistakable sound of a battering ram struck my front entrance. We were gone long before they breached the perimeter. The ensuing week required rigorous operational discipline. I relocated my primary terminal to a secure safe house provided by Beatrice, monitoring the situation from a distance. The FBI finalized their audit of Julian's servers, corroborating every piece of data I had extracted. The net was closing, but Julian remained oblivious, clinging desperately to his fabricated reality. This delusion culminated during the Thanksgiving holiday. Julian hosted the annual dinner at our parents' sprawling suburban estate, treating the event as a grand theatrical production. He hired a private catering team to serve the meal, projecting the image of a flawless, thriving executive. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table wearing a crisp, tailored suit, holding a glass of vintage Pinot Noir. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass, demanding the attention of the room. The false sincerity in his voice was nauseating. "I want to express my gratitude for family today," Julian announced, his gaze sweeping over our parents. "To ensure that our legacy remains secure against any market volatility, I have finalized the paperwork to officially transfer all familial assets and inheritance trusts into my direct management. It is my duty to protect you from financial risks." He smiled, a wide, predatory grin disguised as filial devotion. He then turned his attention to me, sitting quietly near the end of the table. "And Chloe," he added, his tone dripping with mock generosity, I know things have been difficult for you. I have decided to sign the title of the old family sedan over to your name. Hopefully it will make your commute from the rental unit a bit more comfortable." Our parents beamed, nodding in agreement. They praised his selflessness, completely unaware that he had already hollowed out their retirement accounts and mortgaged the very roof over their heads. Julian basked in their approval, convinced he had successfully manipulated the narrative. I did not argue. I did not throw my napkin or storm away from the table. I picked up my knife, sliced a small piece of turkey, and chewed slowly. I let him perform his monologue. The satisfaction of a well-executed strategy lies in the timing, not the volume of the response. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Nia lightly tapped the toe of her shoe against my ankle. I offered a subtle nod. My phone resting discreetly beside my plate vibrated with a single encrypted notification. I glanced down at the screen. The message originated from the lead FBI agent coordinating the task force. The text was brief and definitive. A federal judge had signed the comprehensive search and seizure warrants. The raid on Julian's lobbying firm, his accounts, and his personal residences was scheduled to commence at 0600 hours on Monday morning. The endgame was in motion. Julian, however, possessed the paranoid intuition of a seasoned con artist. He sensed an unseen pressure. He recognized that verbal agreements and digital transfers were vulnerable. He needed absolute, irrevocable legal control to finalize his escape plan before any regulatory body caught up with him. He set his wineglass down and reached into the breast pocket of his suit. He produced a thick, multi-page legal document, unfolding it with a crisp snap. He smoothed the papers onto the table right next to the gravy boat. "I had my attorney draft a comprehensive power of attorney," Julian stated, his voice adopting a hard, urgent edge. "It covers both medical and financial directives. I need you both to sign this tonight. It will streamline the asset transfer process and eliminate any bureaucratic delays." He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and held it out toward our father. The demand was aggressive, rushed. He was attempting to secure the final legal authority to strip them bare before the federal hammer fell. "Just a standard precaution," Mom, Julian said, his tone slick and reassuring. "It allows me to authorize medical treatments and manage the healthcare trusts without navigating miles of red tape. It is purely administrative." He pushed the document closer to my father, his finger tapping impatiently beside the signature line. The document, however, contained far more than standard medical directives. Buried deep within the dense legal jargon was a specialized clause. Julian had embedded a stipulation designed to formally disinherit me, citing fabricated concerns about my financial instability and mental competence. He was attempting to legally erase me from the family structure, ensuring I could never challenge his theft of the estate. To legitimize the transaction, Julian had brought a guest to the dinner. A man introduced as Robert Vance, Julian's personal attorney, sat quietly near the end of the table. Vance wore an expensive, ill-fitting suit and sported the practiced, unctuous smile of a man who dealt in loopholes. He nodded reassuringly as Julian presented the paperwork, acting as the official witness to the execution of the document. My parents, blinded by decades of misplaced trust, did not bother to read the fine print. They saw their successful son taking charge, lifting the burden of management from their aging shoulders. My father reached for the gold fountain pen. I did not lunge across the table to snatch the paper away. I did not raise my voice or attempt to expose the hidden clause. I remained seated, swirling the dark red wine in my glass. Julian threw a smug, victorious glance in my direction. He believed his trap had sprung flawlessly, that he had successfully marginalized me while cementing his total control. He failed to realize the depth of the intelligence I had gathered. My background checks on Julian's associates were thorough. The man sitting at our table, Robert Vance, was not a practicing attorney. He had been disbarred 6 months prior following a state bar investigation into his misappropriation of client funds. The paperwork he presented was inherently fraudulent, and his presence as a witnessing legal authority elevated the entire charade from a civil dispute to a criminal conspiracy. By attempting to coerce my parents into signing over their assets using a disbarred lawyer, Julian had inadvertently handed me the exact statutory violation needed to trigger an immediate elder abuse and financial fraud indictment. My father pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. I set my wineglass down. I unlocked my phone, selected a pre-drafted email, and pressed send. The message was routed directly to the State Bar Association's investigative unit, CCing the federal task force monitoring Julian. It contained the GPS coordinates of our location, a photograph of Vance sitting at our Thanksgiving table, and a notification that a disbarred attorney was actively facilitating the fraudulent transfer of senior citizen assets. 10 seconds later, the jarring ringtone of a cell phone pierced the quiet dining room. Vance jumped in his seat. He pulled his phone from his jacket, annoyed by the interruption. He glanced at the caller ID. The smug confidence melted off his face instantly. His skin turned an ashen, sickly gray. He answered the call, pressing the phone tight against his ear. He did not speak. He listened for exactly 5 seconds. His eyes widened in sheer terror, darting nervously around the room, as if expecting tactical teams to burst through the windows. He ended the call abruptly and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He stood up with such force that his chair tipped backward, crashing onto the hardwood floor. "I apologize," Vance stammered, his voice breathless and frantic. "A severe medical emergency. I have to leave. Now." He did not wait for Julian to respond. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the floor and bolted toward the front door. He moved with the desperate speed of a man trying to outrun a prison sentence, leaving the fraudulent power of attorney sitting abandoned next to the cranberry sauce. Julian stood frozen at the head of the table, his jaw slackened. The carefully orchestrated theater of the evening had collapsed in a matter of seconds. He stared at the front door, then down at the unsigned document. He could not comprehend why his hired gun had fled in a panic. The invisible noose I had prepared was tightening, and Julian had just felt the first real constraint around his throat. The abrupt departure of his fake attorney left Julian grasping at shadows. His Thanksgiving scheme had evaporated, leaving him exposed to a rising tide of debt. Panic replaced his usual arrogance. He needed an immediate infusion of capital, a political miracle to stop the federal scrutiny. His survival depended on securing a government bailout package, a lifeline only a few key policymakers could grant. To win that favor, he had to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. He secured a seat at the most exclusive philanthropic event of the winter season, a black-tie charity auction hosted in the grand ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel. The guest list was a curated roster of Washington power brokers, including the specific senior senator whose influence Julian desperately needed to buy. The Mayflower Ballroom was a theater of influence. Gold leaf accents lined the vaulted ceilings. Waiters in tailored uniforms circulated with trays of vintage champagne. The room hummed with the quiet conversations of billionaires, diplomats, and industry titans. Julian arrived alone, his smile fixed and rigid. He sought out the senator, positioning himself nearby, ready to perform his role as a thriving, untouchable lobbyist. He needed to make a public display of financial dominance to convince the room he was a man worth saving. The auction commenced. Rare artifacts, historical documents, and priceless experiences were paraded across the stage. Julian waited for the right moment. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional with a crisp British accent, presented the centerpiece of the evening. It was a flawless 18th-century desk clock, a piece of political history previously owned by a founding father. The bidding started high, thinning the herd of casual participants. Julian saw his opening. He raised his numbered paddle high. He called out a bid of $150,000. The number echoed over the sound system. The room fell into a respectful hush. Julian lowered his paddle and adjusted his cuffs. He turned slightly, ensuring the senator caught his eye. He offered a modest, practiced nod, projecting the image of a man for whom such a sum was mere pocket change. He felt the tension leave his shoulders. He believed he had done it. He had bought his way back into the inner circle. The auctioneer scanned the floor, finding no challengers. The heavy wooden gavel rose into the air. $500,000. The voice did not come from the main floor. It floated down from the elevated VIP balcony, calm, resonant, and effortlessly cutting through the silence. Every head in the ballroom pivoted upward. Julian froze, the triumphant smile dying on his lips. He slowly looked toward the velvet-draped balcony. I stood near the railing. I did not wear sequins or heavy jewels. I wore a minimalist floor-length black evening gown, a garment that projected quiet, undeniable authority. Beatrice Sterling sat beside me in a leather wingback chair, resting her hands on her silver cane. She offered a small, approving smile, watching the scene unfold with the detached amusement of a chess grandmaster. Julian gripped the edge of his table. His knuckles turned stark white. The polished facade he had maintained for the senator shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He could not comprehend my presence in the VIP tier, let alone the astronomical bid I had just placed. The humiliation of being outbid by the sister he treated like dirt pushed him over the edge of rational behavior. He abandoned every rule of high society etiquette. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger toward the balcony. "She does not have that kind of money," Julian shouted, his voice cracking and shrill. "She is a fraud. Check her credit. I demand you verify her funds right now. She lives in a basement." The dignified silence of the Mayflower ballroom morphed into shocked whispers. Billionaires and politicians stared at Julian. His outburst was vulgar, a grotesque display of insecurity that violated the unspoken codes of the elite. The senator seated nearby visibly recoiled, stepping away from Julian as if his desperation were contagious. The auctioneer did not flinch at the disruption. He maintained a posture of supreme professionalism. He tapped a finger against the earpiece resting in his left ear, listening to a communication from the financial verification team working backstage. The room waited, the tension stretching tight across the elegant space. The auctioneer, his voice was smooth and unbothered. "That will not be necessary, sir," the auctioneer announced, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "Director Chloe, operating on behalf of the Sterling Cybernetics Investment Fund, has just cleared the payment via direct wire transfer. The transaction is fully verified and successful." He brought the gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. "Sold to the director on the balcony." The whispers rippled through the crowd, transforming into an audible wave of judgment. The realization struck the attendees simultaneously. The man shouting on the floor was not a wealthy insider. He was an erratic, unstable liability who had just attempted to humiliate a prominent director of a major defense contractor. The senator shook his head, signaling his aides to guide him toward the exit. Julian had not secured a lifeline. He had publicly incinerated his own reputation. Julian stood paralyzed. The luxurious walls of the Mayflower Hotel felt like a crushing weight. He looked at the faces of the people he had spent years trying to impress. They were looking back at him with pure, undisguised contempt. His suit felt suffocating. His carefully constructed life was dissolving in front of an audience of hundreds. Then the final blow arrived. A sharp, incessant buzzing erupted from his jacket pocket. He reached inside with numb fingers and pulled out his smartphone. The screen was flooded with high-priority alerts. They were not messages from clients or allies. They were automated notifications from his corporate banking institutions. Julian stared at the glaring text. Every single account tied to his lobbying firm, his personal name, and his shell corporations had been flagged. The balances read zero. A sweeping federal injunction had just locked down his entire financial network. The wire fraud investigation had transitioned from an audit to an active asset freeze. He was standing in a room of billionaires, wearing a suit he could no longer afford, realizing he could not even pay for a taxi ride home. The panic in his chest turned into a cold, suffocating dread. His phone continued to buzz relentlessly, vibrating against his palm like a death knell. He looked up at the balcony one last time. I did not smile. I did not offer a mock salute. I simply turned away, stepping back into the shadows of the VIP lounge with Beatrice. The sheer magnitude of Julian's public execution was not just about the money. It was about the systemic dismantling of his identity. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an aura of invincibility. He viewed wealth not as a tool, but as a weapon to bludgeon those he deemed inferior. By stripping him of his perceived dominance in the very arena he revered, I had broken his psychological foundation. The attendees at the charity gala were not forgiving people. They operated in a city where influence was currency and weakness was an invitation for ruin. Julian had displayed catastrophic weakness. The rapid spread of gossip through the ballroom guaranteed that his name would be blacklisted before the night concluded. Lobbying requires trust, discretion, and the projection of power. Julian now possessed none of those attributes. He stumbled backward, bumping into a tray stand. A crystal champagne flute tipped over, shattering on the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound drew another round of disgusted glances from the surrounding elite. A hotel security guard, noticing the erratic behavior and the broken glass, began walking purposefully toward Julian's position. Julian did not wait to be escorted out. He turned and fled toward the exit, pushing past diplomats and corporate heirs. He burst through the heavy brass doors of the Mayflower Hotel and into the biting cold of the Washington night. The chill air did nothing to sober his racing mind. He stared at his phone, swiping frantically through his banking applications. The red error messages stared back at him, unyielding and permanent. Federal hold. Asset seizure protocol. Initiated. Account suspended. His breath plumed in the cold air. The streetlights illuminated the terror etched into his features. He had no access to capital. His overseas escape routes had been severed by the cyber team at Sterling. His political allies had just witnessed his spectacular self-destruction. He was cornered, stripped of his resources, and facing imminent federal prosecution. In the mind of a narcissist, accountability is never internalized. Julian did not blame himself for the forged documents or the stolen retirement funds. He blamed the system. He blamed Beatrice. Most of all, he blamed me. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed a source of immediate liquidity to hire a defense attorney before the FBI issued an arrest warrant. He looked down the busy avenue, watching the brake lights of passing cars. His options were reduced to zero. He had drained his own accounts. He had drained Nia's accounts. There was only one well left to tap: the people who had blindly signed over their power of attorney, the people who still viewed him as their flawless, successful son. He marched toward his car, his mind racing with a new frantic narrative he would spin to extract the last remaining drops of wealth from our parents. He had no idea I was already tracking his vehicle's GPS, waiting for him to make his final fatal mistake. The morning sun cut harsh angles through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment. The silence of the secure building was shattered before 10 o'clock. The concierge buzzed my private line, sounding uneasy, as he announced that my parents were demanding immediate entry. I authorized their access, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and waited in the center of the spacious living area. They did not knock. My father pushed the heavy oak door open, striding into my home with a volatile mix of panic and entitlement. My mother trailed behind him, wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the modern, expansive interior. They had never visited this apartment. For years, they assumed I still resided in the cramped basement unit Julian constantly mocked. The stark reality of my living conditions barely registered with them. They were consumed by a singular, frantic objective. My father did not offer a greeting. He bypassed the luxury furnishings and marched directly toward me, his face tight with strained authority. "Julian is facing a minor tax complication," my father declared, his voice hard, adopting the tone of a patriarch issuing a non-negotiable command. He explained that a clerical error triggered a temporary freeze on his accounts. "You have resources. You clearly have money you have been hiding from us. You are going to write a check and bail your brother out. We are not going to let this ruin the family reputation." He framed a multi-million-dollar federal fraud investigation as a trivial accounting mistake. Julian had clearly reached them first, spinning a desperate narrative to weaponize their loyalty. My mother stepped forward, tears pooling in her eyes, utilizing the emotional manipulation that had governed our family dynamics for decades. "You have to save him, Chloe," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He is your brother. If you turn your back on him now when you clearly have the means to help, you are no daughter of mine. We will cut you off completely." The threat of disownment hung in the air. It was a hollow ultimatum. They were threatening to sever a connection that I had already emotionally dismantled. I looked at the two people who had raised me. They had spent 30 years enabling Julian's narcissism, funding his arrogance, and dismissing my quiet achievements. They demanded I sacrifice my stability to protect a son who viewed them as nothing more than an ATM. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to argue against Julian's fabricated tax story. Emotional pleas are useless against ingrained denial. Facts require no translation. I set my coffee mug on the kitchen island. I walked over to my desk, unlocked the secure drawer, and pulled out a thick-bound dossier. The pages contained the raw, unredacted financial data I had extracted from Julian's hidden servers, cross-referenced with the FBI audit logs. I walked back to the living area and tossed the heavy file onto the glass coffee table. The resulting slap of paper against glass echoed sharply. "Turn to page 3. I instructed, my tone flat and devoid of empathy. My father glared at me, insulted by my lack of compliance. He snatched the dossier off the table, intending to dismiss it as some trivial IT report. He flipped to the 3rd page. The silence that followed was suffocating. The document was not a tax notice. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the unauthorized liquidation of their joint retirement accounts. The page clearly displayed the forged transfer authorizations, moving over $800,000 from their secure Vanguard funds directly into Julian's offshore shell corporations. My father's eyes scanned the numbers. The rigid set of his jaw began to slacken. He flipped to the 4th page, his hands beginning to shake. This page contained the property records. It showed the high-yield secondary mortgage Julian had secretly placed on their suburban home, leveraging the deed against a loan from an unregulated private equity firm. The final column displayed the outstanding balance compounded by predatory interest rates. "He did not just lose his money," I stated, breaking the silence. "He stole yours. You do not have a retirement fund. You do not own your home. Julian used your signatures to secure debt from a shadow syndicate. You are currently in default, and the foreclosure process will initiate by the end of the month." The denial evaporated. The reality of their total financial ruin crashed down on them. My mother let out a strangled, breathless sound. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the expensive rug, pressing her hands against her face, sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child illusion was dead. My father dropped the dossier. The pages scattered across the glass table. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. The man who had entered my apartment demanding obedience was now gasping for air, crushed by the weight of his son's betrayal. Before I could call for medical assistance, the apartment door, which my parents had failed to secure, slammed open against the wall. Julian stormed into the room. His appearance was shocking. The bespoke suit was wrinkled and stained. His tie was missing. He looked like a man who had spent the night running from ghosts. He ignored our parents collapsing on the floor. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me. In his right hand, he tightly gripped a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. "You think you are so smart?" Julian snarled, his voice guttural and erratic. He marched toward me, slamming the photographs onto the table alongside the financial dossier. He pointed a shaking finger at the images. "I found your little side project," he hissed, a manic, desperate energy fueling his words. "I know what you do. If you do not wire $2 million to my account right now, these go straight to the press. You will be in federal prison before the week is over." Julian presented the photographs like a winning lottery ticket. The images showed blurred lines of source code, secure facility layouts, and encrypted communication logs bearing the Sterling Cybernetics watermark. He stood over the glass table, his chest heaving, convinced he possessed the ultimate leverage. "I know what you are doing, Chloe." Julian sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "You are selling defense secrets. I managed to extract these files before your little lockdown protocol shut me out of my own servers." He leaned closer, invading my personal space. "You are going to wire $2 million to a routing number I provide. If the transfer does not clear in 10 minutes, these photos go to every major news outlet in Washington, and I send the digital copies straight to the Pentagon. You think my fraud is bad? You are looking at a treason charge." My parents stopped crying. The threat of federal prison shifted the atmosphere in the room from despair to stunned silence. My father looked at the photos, then at me, waiting for a denial, waiting for me to panic the way Julian expected. I did not flinch. I did not look at the photographs. I reached across the kitchen island, picked up my laptop, and smoothly rotated the screen to face Julian. "You severely underestimate the architecture of counterintelligence," I stated, my tone analytical and precise. I tapped a single key. The screen displayed a complex telemetry map tracking the exact IP address and download history of the files Julian had printed. The data traced directly back to his personal device. "Those files do not contain classified defense secrets," I explained, watching his smug expression begin to falter. "They are part of a localized honeypot, a deceptive digital snare engineered specifically by my division to identify and neutralize internal security threats. The code is gibberish designed to alert the network the moment it is accessed or duplicated by an unauthorized user." Julian stared at the screen. The reality of his error was slow to penetrate his manic desperation. By extracting those files from my secure partition, retaining them, and attempting to use them for financial extortion, I continued, "You did not uncover espionage. You committed it. You just handed the Department of Justice prosecutorial evidence of corporate espionage and federal blackmail. The audit was a financial inquiry. This makes it a national security incident." The color drained from Julian's face for the second time that week. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The leverage he thought he held was actually a self-inflicted snare. He staggered backward, knocking against a bar stool. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He looked at the photographs on the table not as a weapon, but as a guaranteed prison sentence. His extortion attempt had failed spectacularly. He needed an alternate source of capital, immediately, something he could liquidate before the federal agents arrived with an arrest warrant. He spun around, his frantic gaze landing on our parents, who were still huddled on the floor watching him with a mixture of horror and revulsion. "The farm," Julian blurted out, his voice shrill, shedding any remaining pretense of dignity. "Mom, Dad, the old inheritance acreage upstate. It is fully paid off. It is not tied to the mortgages. Sign the deed over to me right now. I have a buyer lined up. I can sell it today for cash. We can fix this. I just need that land." He was begging the people he had just bankrupted to surrender their final microscopic safety net. He fell to his knees beside my father, grabbing his arm, shaking him. "You have to do this for me, Dad. They are going to lock me up. I am your son." My father stared at Julian. The golden child facade had burned away, leaving a desperate, parasitic stranger. My father slowly pulled his arm free from Julian's grip. He did not speak. The silence was a definitive rejection. Julian scrambled to his feet, letting out a frustrated primal yell. He paced the room, running his hands over his face, searching for another angle, another victim to exploit. The heavy apartment door clicked open again. Nia stepped into the entryway. She did not wear the casual weekend attire typical of a family visit. She wore a sharp, tailored business suit projecting the icy demeanor of an auditor delivering a final assessment. She carried a sleek leather portfolio. She walked into the living room, bypassing Julian entirely. She stepped over the scattered financial documents and the useless Honeypot photographs. She stopped in front of the coffee table, opened her portfolio, and extracted a single crisp legal document. She dropped it directly on top of the pile. Julian stared at the paper. "That is an emergency injunction from the family court," Nia announced, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet apartment. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, the judge has authorized an absolute freeze on all marital assets, joint accounts, and properties. You cannot sell, transfer, or liquidate a single dime." Julian looked from the document to his wife. His chest heaved. Nia had effectively barricaded his final exit route, trapping him inside the burning building of his own creation. But Julian, driven by the pure instinct of a cornered predator, possessed one last desperate card to play. He knew of a pending corporate merger, a massive lobbying consolidation he had orchestrated weeks ago, a deal that required his signature to finalize. If he could force the merger through today, the buyout clause would trigger an automatic, unfreezable cash payout. He turned on his heel and sprinted out the door, aiming for the boardroom of his rival firm. Julian fled my apartment, his mind fixated on a singular, high-stakes objective. He needed liquidity, and he needed it fast. His remaining option was an aggressive corporate merger he had been negotiating for months. He had positioned his struggling lobbying firm as an attractive acquisition target for Vanguard Strategies, a massive predatory conglomerate looking to expand its footprint in Washington. The buyout clause contained a golden parachute that would trigger a multi-million-dollar payout upon the transfer of control. It was cash that could not be easily frozen if the transfer happened quickly enough. Tuesday morning arrived with a harsh, unyielding light. Julian had somehow managed to clean himself up, donning a fresh suit and projecting the polished, confident demeanor of a successful executive. He sat in Vanguard's expansive glass-walled boardroom located on the top floor of a sleek K Street high-rise. The panoramic view of the Capitol building served as a fitting backdrop for his final performance. He sat across from Vanguard's executive board, smoothly delivering his pitch. He promised access to a highly classified network of political assets and guaranteed lucrative defense contracts. He glossed over his recent setbacks, framing his firm's operational restructuring as an opportunity for synergistic growth. He was charming, persuasive, and entirely deceptive. The Vanguard CEO, a seasoned corporate raider named Harrison, listened intently. He steepled his fingers reviewing the preliminary term sheet resting on the polished mahogany table. "Your network access is compelling." Julian Harrison noted his tone, measuring the value of the asset. "The structural terms are acceptable. We are prepared to execute the acquisition today. We are simply waiting for the final sign-off from the primary underwriter at our managing investment fund." Julian's smile widened. The trapdoor of federal prison was closing behind him, but he believed he had found the latch to the escape hatch. He reached into his jacket, producing his favored gold fountain pen, ready to sign away his fraudulent empire for a clean getaway. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. I stepped into the room. I wore a sharply tailored black suit, projecting a cold corporate authority that matched the environment. I was flanked by two senior corporate attorneys from Morrison and Blake, carrying thick leather briefcases. Harrison stood up, extending a welcoming hand toward me. "Gentlemen," Harrison announced to his board, "please welcome the Director of Mergers and Acquisitions for the Sterling Cybernetics Investment Fund. They are backing this venture." Julian's hand froze midair. The gold pen slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. The blood rushed from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen hue. His mouth opened and closed, struggling to form syllables, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He stared at me as if an apparition had just manifested in the executive suite. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not acknowledge his shock. I walked purposefully to the head of the table, taking the seat reserved for the primary stakeholder. I opened a leather portfolio and extracted a copy of Julian's proposed merger agreement. I took my time. I let the silence stretch across the room, allowing the weight of my presence to suffocate his remaining confidence. I looked down at the document, tracing a line of text with my finger. "Your firm does not possess the structural integrity required for a standard acquisition." Julian restated, my voice echoing clearly in the vast space. I did not raise my pitch. The volume was unnecessary when the facts were lethal. Julian gripped the edge of the table. You cannot be here," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Harrison. "She is a low-level technician. She does not represent Sterling. This is a targeted disruption." Harrison frowned, looking at Julian with mild annoyance before turning his attention back to me. I ignored Julian's outburst and addressed the Vanguard board directly. I signaled to my attorneys, who began distributing dense bound reports to every executive at the table. "The valuation metrics presented by this firm are entirely fabricated," I declared, watching the board members open the dossiers. "A forensic audit conducted by our intelligence division confirms systemic structural rot. The firm carries massive undisclosed toxic debt. The accounting ledgers contain fraudulent entries designed to obscure the liquidation of private family trusts. Furthermore, the client roster is padded with ghost accounts tied to unregistered foreign entities." The executives flipped through the pages. The evidence was irrefutable. Julian had attempted to sell a burning building, and the structural fire had just been documented for the buyers. "We are not executing an acquisition." I concluded, closing the portfolio with a definitive snap. The liability risk is catastrophic. However, Sterling Cybernetics holds the primary lien on the debt this firm owes to various shadow syndicates. We are initiating a hostile takeover to liquidate the remaining physical assets. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Julian. "We are purchasing the firm for exactly $1. Julian snapped. The thin veneer of civility evaporated. He lunged out of his chair, slamming his hands onto the table, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed. "You cannot do this!" he roared, his face contorted in rage. "This is illegal. I will sue you. I will sue Vanguard. I will have you removed from this building." He turned toward the glass doors and yelled for security to intervene. He demanded the guards remove the unauthorized intruders from the boardroom. The glass doors opened. Two towering building security officers stepped into the room. They did not approach me. They walked directly toward Julian. Mr. Hastings, the lead officer, said, his tone devoid of any respect. "The building management has been informed of the ownership transfer. Your access credentials have been revoked. We are here to escort you to your office so you can collect your personal belongings before vacating the premises." Julian looked at the guards, then at Harrison, and finally at me. He was standing in the center of his own boardroom, surrounded by executives who now viewed him as a toxic liability. He had been stripped of his company, his wealth, and his dignity. As the guards moved to flank him, Julian's mind raced toward the only remaining variable he could control. He needed to extract whatever untraceable assets he had left before the federal freeze became absolute. He glared at me, a venomous, desperate promise in his eyes, before allowing the guards to march him out of the room. He needed to coordinate with Nia. He believed she was still unaware of the full scope of the fallout, and she held the key to the final offshore accounts. The abrupt ejection from Vanguard headquarters left Julian disoriented and frantic. He stumbled out of the high-rise and onto K Street, the mid-morning sun glaring off the pavement. The city moved around him, indifferent to the collapse of his empire. His breathing was shallow. The hostile takeover had severed his access to legitimate capital, but his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He needed a conduit to the remaining offshore funds, and he needed a way out of the country before the federal indictment dropped. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he dialed his wife's number. He paced the sidewalk, barking orders the moment she answered. "Nia, listen to me carefully," Julian said, his voice clipped and urgent. "Pack the travel bags. Bring the passports. We are leaving for Europe tonight. Do not ask questions. Meet me at the Oakwood Country Club dining room in 1 hour." He terminated the call without waiting for her response. He operated under the delusion that Nia remained the compliant, uninformed spouse he had molded her to be. He believed she was insulated from the reality of his financial crimes, a passive asset he could easily manipulate for a quick extraction. Julian sought refuge in the familiar luxury of the Oakwood Country Club. It was a bastion of old money and exclusivity, a place where he had spent years cultivating his image among the political elite. He walked past the manicured putting greens and entered the opulent wood-paneled dining room. The familiar scent of aged leather and expensive cigars usually calmed him, but today it offered no solace. He chose a secluded booth in the corner, drumming his fingers nervously against the polished mahogany table. He checked his watch repeatedly, anticipating Nia's arrival with the luggage necessary for their escape. When Nia finally appeared at the entrance of the dining room, Julian's impatience briefly morphed into confusion. She did not carry suitcases. She did not look like a woman fleeing the country in a panic. Nia wore a striking, impeccably tailored crimson dress. Her posture was flawless. The subdued, exhausted wife from the White House gala had vanished entirely. She moved with the predatory grace of a senior auditor who had just uncovered the ultimate discrepancy. She projected an aura of absolute terrifying control. She glided across the dining room, ignoring the subtle, appreciative glances from the surrounding members. She stopped at Julian's booth. He opened his mouth to reprimand her for arriving empty-handed, but the words died in his throat when she dropped 3 thick-bound dossiers onto the table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood commanded his immediate attention. Nia did not sit down. She remained standing, looking down at the man who had systematically dismantled their shared life. "What is this?" Julian hissed, glancing nervously at the other tables. "Where are the passports? We do not have time for games." Nia rested her manicured fingertips on the first dossier. Item 1. Nia announced, her voice calm, resonant, and devoid of affection. The petition for divorce. It cites irreconcilable differences compounded by profound financial deception. Julian stared at her, uncomprehending. His brain failed to process the shift in power dynamics. Nia shifted her hand to the second file. Item 2, she continued. The emergency custody order. It grants me sole absolute physical and legal custody of the children effective immediately. The judge cited your erratic behavior and the active federal investigations as a clear and present danger to their welfare. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. He started to rise from the booth, his hands balling into fists. He intended to exert physical dominance to silence her before she caused a scene in his beloved sanctuary. Nia did not flinch. She tapped the third and final dossier. Item 3, she stated, locking eyes with him. A comprehensive forensic report submitted to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. It details the precise methodology you utilized to forge my signature and establish the offshore shell corporations holding your illicit tax liabilities. The color vanished from Julian's face. The reality of his wife's intelligence, which he had actively suppressed for years, had returned to execute him. He realized she had not been waiting blindly at home. She had been meticulously dismantling his life while he was busy fighting battles on other fronts. He lunged forward, reaching across the table to snatch the documents intending to tear the evidence to pieces. Before his fingers could graze the paper, two men seated at the adjacent table abruptly stood up. They were not fellow country club members enjoying a midday scotch. They wore unassuming suits, but their movements were tactical and aggressive. They closed the distance in seconds, stepping directly behind Julian. One of the men placed a heavy, authoritative hand firmly on Julian's shoulder, forcing him back into the booth. "Sit down, sir," the undercover officer commanded quietly, flipping open a badge holder to display a gleaming silver shield. "Do not make a scene." Julian slumped back into the leather upholstery, the fight draining out of him instantly. He looked at the federal agents, then up at his wife. He was trapped, immobilized by the consequences of his own arrogance. Nia looked at him with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. She picked up her designer handbag and turned to leave. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Do not worry about the club dues, Julian," she said smoothly. "I canceled your membership this morning." She walked away, her crimson dress, a flash of color moving through the dim, wood-paneled room. She left him sitting under the watchful eyes of federal agents, holding the wreckage of his marriage and his freedom. Julian watched her exit the dining room. Despair washed over him, thick and suffocating. His lobbying firm was liquidated. His domestic accounts were frozen. His wife had initiated a surgical strike that severed his access to his children and reported his tax fraud to the IRS. He was effectively checkmated. Yet the mind of a seasoned grifter rarely accepts total defeat. As he sat pinned in the booth, his panic subsided into a cold, desperate calculation. The domestic funds were gone, and the Cayman accounts were likely compromised by Nia's audit. But there was one hidden reserve he had never disclosed to anyone, not even his wife. He possessed a decentralized cryptocurrency wallet, holding a substantial sum securely hidden on a Swiss server. It was an untraceable digital vault, accessible only via a complex alphanumeric key he had memorized. If he could reach an unsecured terminal and execute a rapid transfer, he could still secure the capital needed to vanish before the federal indictment dropped. He just needed to find a computer. The undercover officers at the country club had only been tasked with observing Julian's movements, awaiting the formal issuance of the arrest warrant. Julian, driven by pure survival instinct, exploited a brief moment when the agents shifted their focus. He slipped through the kitchen service corridor, abandoning his luxurious facade, and sprinted into the alleyway behind the club. He navigated the back streets of the city, avoiding the main thoroughfares where surveillance cameras tracked every movement. His expensive leather shoes scuffed against broken pavement. His bespoke suit clung to him, damp with terrified sweat. He needed internet access, but his personal devices were likely compromised by federal tracking algorithms. He found refuge in a dilapidated cyber cafe on the edge of the warehouse district. The neon sign above the door flickered erratically. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Rows of outdated computer terminals sat in dim lighting, occupied by patrons seeking cheap, anonymous connectivity. Julian dropped a crumpled $20 bill onto the counter, bypassing the attendant's gaze, and hurried to a terminal in the far corner. He slid into the worn plastic chair. His hands shook as he manipulated the mouse. This was his final redoubt. He accessed a secure encrypted browser, navigating the dark web protocols necessary to reach his hidden Swiss cryptocurrency wallet. It contained the digital equivalent of $3 million of fortune, acquired through illicit kickbacks and siphoned campaign contributions. It was enough capital to purchase a new identity, secure passage out of the country, and begin again. It was his ultimate safety net. He carefully typed the complex 64-character alphanumeric passphrase from memory. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. The stakes were absolute. He pressed enter. The screen went blank. The loading icon spun lazily in the center of the monitor, an agonizing digital delay. Julian leaned closer, his breath fogging the dusty screen. The dashboard materialized. The user interface loaded, displaying the secure vault icon. Julian's eyes darted to the top right corner, seeking the familiar multi-million-dollar balance. The number displayed on the screen was absolute, 0.00 USD. Julian froze. His brain short-circuited. He blinked rapidly, convincing himself it was a display error, a lagging connection on the outdated terminal. He slammed his finger against the refresh key. He hit it again and again, the rhythmic clacking echoing loudly in the quiet cafe. The number did not change. The vault was empty. A primal panic seized him. He pounded his fist against the cheap keyboard, cracking the plastic casing. He cursed at the monitor, his voice raw and ragged. Suddenly the screen glitched. The browser interface vanished entirely. A stark white pop-up window dominated the center of the monitor. It was not a network error message or a standard security warning. The text displayed the authoritative seal of the United States Department of Justice, accompanied by a formal legal directive. The text was terrifyingly concise. It stated that the assets formerly held in the digital wallet had been seized under the provisions of the National Cybersecurity Act. The message cited violations concerning the financing of unregistered foreign agents. Julian's eyes scanned the bottom of the notification. The final line detailed the administrative authority executing the seizure. Executing Administrator, Beatrice Sterling Director, Sterling Cybernetics Security Task Force. The realization hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. The scope of the operation orchestrated against him was total and unyielding. The woman he had mocked as a pathetic elderly landlord possessed the systemic power to eradicate his hidden wealth across international borders. Under my strategic guidance, Beatrice had not merely observed Julian's downfall, she had actively engineered it. She utilized her vast defense contracting resources to legitimately purchase Julian's toxic debt portfolios from the shadow syndicates. This maneuver transformed Sterling Cybernetics into his primary legal creditor. Once the debt was consolidated, she activated international cyber protocols, legally freezing and seizing his offshore digital assets to cover the outstanding liabilities. Julian stared at the screen. The notification remained a digital tombstone for his ambitions. He was stripped bare. He possessed no cash, no credit, no property, and no hidden reserves. He was a man with a shattered reputation and a massive target on his back. He had nothing left to leverage. He pushed his chair back, the harsh scraping sound, drawing irritated glances from the other patrons. He needed to run. He had to disappear into the anonymity of the city before the authorities tracked the IP address of the terminal. He turned toward the exit, his mind desperately calculating a route to the nearest bus station. He took 2 steps toward the door. The sudden piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet of the warehouse district. The sound multiplied, coming from multiple directions, converging rapidly on his location. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively through the dirty front windows of the cyber cafe. Tires screeched as several patrol cars and unmarked federal vehicles surrounded the building, cutting off every possible avenue of escape. The sirens echoing through the warehouse district were not the sound of an impending arrest. They were a calculated psychological pressure tactic. I sat in the secure command center monitoring the thermal feeds. I had instructed the local patrol units to create a visible perimeter but leave a single narrow service alley unguarded. Julian reacted exactly as a cornered predator would. He panicked. He kicked open a rusted ventilation grate in the rear restroom of the cyber cafe and scrambled out into the damp shadows. He navigated the back streets, his breath ragged, genuinely believing his own cunning had allowed him to outmaneuver a federal dragnet. He failed to comprehend that I was simply herding him toward a much more fitting destination. Arresting Julian in a filthy alleyway offered no systemic deterrence. It lacked the necessary weight. A quiet detainment would allow his political associates to feign ignorance, distance themselves cleanly, and pretend they had never funded his corruption. He required a public reckoning. He needed to be dismantled on a stage he revered exposed in front of the very society he had spent decades trying to impress. That evening, the National Lobbying Association hosted its prestigious annual awards gala. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, a cavernous space bathed in the warm glow of tiered crystal chandeliers. The room was filled with the most influential power brokers in Washington. The air hummed with the quiet exchange of political favors, the clinking of fine crystal, and the subtle fragrance of expensive perfumes. Julian viewed this gathering as his final sanctuary. He managed to infiltrate the building using a stolen access card acquired from a former junior associate. He slipped through the service corridors, desperate to reach the main floor. His bespoke suit was severely wrinkled and stained from his escape through the alley. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The polished, untouchable executive had devolved into a frantic fugitive. He intended to locate his old allies, the senators and chief executives he had dined with for years, hoping to secure a private jet or a discreet influx of cash to fund his disappearance. He pushed his way into the crowded ballroom. Guests in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns noticed his erratic demeanor. They stepped aside their expressions, twisting into masks of polite disgust. Julian ignored their stares. His gaze locked onto the main stage at the front of the room. The keynote speaker, a prominent congressional leader, had just concluded his address. The podium stood empty for a brief moment. Julian saw a final, desperate opportunity to control the narrative. He possessed the profound delusion of a true narcissist. He believed that if he could just commandeer the microphone, he could spin a compelling fiction. He planned to announce that he was the victim of a rogue corporate takeover, a martyr, targeted by illegal government overreach. He thought his silver tongue could rally the room to his defense, forcing his powerful peers to protect one of their own. He marched down the center aisle, ascending the carpeted steps of the stage. The event host moved to intercept him, but Julian shoved past the man with a burst of frantic energy. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He tapped the microphone, the sharp thumping sound echoing through the expansive ballroom. The ambient chatter died down immediately. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage, watching the disheveled lobbyist prepare to speak. Julian opened his mouth, drawing a deep breath to deliver his fabricated defense. Before a single syllable left his lips, the audio system cut out. The microphone went entirely dead. The warm golden lighting illuminating the ballroom shifted, dimming into a stark clinical gray. I sat in the elevated VIP balcony overlooking the stage. I rested my tablet on my lap. I executed a remote digital override accessing the venue audio-visual network. The towering high-definition screens flanking the main stage previously displayed the elegant logo of the Lobbying Association. The screens flickered. The logos vanished. A cascade of official, verified legal documents materialized across the digital displays, illuminated in sharp, unforgiving clarity. The text was large enough for every person in the back row to read. The first document was the federal subpoena detailing extensive wire fraud and international money laundering. The screen transitioned, displaying the emergency family court injunction that froze his marital assets due to severe financial deception. The visual evidence did not stop. I cued the final, most devastating file. The screens showcased the itemized forensic ledger detailing the forged signatures and the systematic draining of our parents' retirement funds. At the top of every single document, the name Julian Hastings was printed in bold, unyielding typography. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. The silence that followed was suffocating. The elite attendees, men and women whose careers depended on risk mitigation, read the charges illuminating the stage. The evidence of elder abuse and systemic fraud was irrefutable. Julian turned his head, looking at the giant screens behind him. His eyes widened. The fabricated reality he had planned to spin dissolved into dust. He looked back at the crowd. The senators, the corporate executives, and the political allies he considered his friends were physically recoiling. They turned their backs, creating a wide, empty perimeter around the stage, treating him like a toxic contagion. They recognized that standing near him was career suicide. The heavy brass doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. The orchestrated delay was over. A dozen agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched into the venue. They wore dark tactical vests, adorned with gleaming gold shields, presenting a jarring contrast to the formal wear of the guests. Their boots moved in unison against the hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic march that cut through the silence of the room. Dozens of press photographers, tipped off minutes earlier, followed close behind the agents, raising their cameras with predatory focus. The agents ascended the stage. Julian did not run. He had no avenues left. The lead agent grabbed Julian by the shoulder, spinning him around with professional force. The metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed over the quiet crowd. The flashes of press cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing the once untouchable lobbyist in his lowest, most humiliating moment. The images would dominate the morning news cycle across the nation. Julian struggled weakly against the restraints. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He scanned the room, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He tilted his head upward, searching the shadows of the elevated tiers. His gaze locked onto the VIP balcony. I stood near the velvet railing. Admiral Thomas and Beatrice Sterling stood firmly by my side, their postures projecting silent authority. I did not offer Julian a triumphant grin. I did not wave or utter a single word of victory. Arrogance is the province of the weak. I reached over to a small side table and picked up a crystal glass filled with iced water. I maintained direct eye contact with my brother as the federal agents began to march him toward the exit. I raised the glass a few inches in his direction. It was a silent, clinical acknowledgement, a final toast to the systemic eradication of a man who had built a kingdom on illusions and severely underestimated the quiet architect holding the match. The flash of press cameras outside the hotel transitioned rapidly into the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent glare of a federal courtroom. Julian Hastings, the man who once believed a gold-embossed card elevated him above the law, sat at the defense table, wearing standard-issue detention khakis. His tailored suits and silk ties were confiscated property, replaced by the uniform of a federal inmate. His posture, once rigid with unearned superiority, had crumbled into a hollow slump. The trial did not drag on for months into a theatrical media circus. The digital footprint I secured from his servers, combined with the comprehensive forensic ledger Nia submitted, left his defense attorneys with zero tactical recourse. Every forged signature, every unauthorized wire transfer, and every illicit offshore deposit was documented, time-stamped, and verified by government analysts. Julian attempted to negotiate a plea bargain offering to expose his political contacts in exchange for leniency. The prosecution declined the offer. The judge handed down a definitive sentence of 15 years without the possibility of early parole. His charges spanned wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and attempted industrial espionage. The lobbying association scrubbed his name from their directories before the gavel even struck the sounding block. His legacy in Washington was permanently erased. I was reduced to a cautionary tale, a whispered warning among junior aides about the severe consequences of unchecked hubris. The collateral damage of Julian's ambition settled heavily upon the people who had enabled his delusion for decades. My parents faced a brutal reckoning. The sprawling suburban estate with its manicured hedges and wraparound porch went into immediate foreclosure. The shadow lending syndicate Julian borrowed from liquidated their remaining assets to cover the defaulted loans. The golden child had stripped them bare, leaving them stranded in the harsh reality of their own blind favoritism. They relocated to a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a bleak industrial suburb on the outskirts of the city. The country club dinners and neighborhood charity galas were replaced by cracked linoleum floors and the relentless hum of nearby highway traffic. Their social circle, the affluent neighbors who used to attend their lavish holiday parties, abandoned them entirely. Association with the Hastings family name carried a toxic stigma that society refused to touch. 6 weeks after the trial concluded, my secure line rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I answered, recognizing my mother's voice instantly. She was weeping, the polished, condescending tone she utilized for years when dismissing my career choices was gone. She begged for forgiveness. She pleaded for a second chance, describing the mold growing in their new bathroom and their inability to afford basic groceries. My father hovered in the background, offering broken, hollow apologies through the receiver. They expected family loyalty to override a lifetime of neglect. They assumed blood ties would automatically secure a financial rescue package. I let them finish their tearful monologues. I did not offer reassurance. I did not express anger or linger on the past injustices. I arranged a meeting the following morning, sending a legal courier rather than attending the appointment personally. The courier delivered a binding, notarized contract. I did not hire a sympathetic family mediator to draft the paperwork. I retained a corporate litigator known for structuring ironclad agreements. The terms presented to my parents were explicit and non-negotiable. I agreed to cover their monthly rent and establish a modest fixed stipend for groceries and essential medical prescriptions. However, the financial support hinged on strict compliance with an unyielding boundary protocol. The contract stipulated zero direct contact, no phone calls, no holiday visits, No unannounced appearances at my residence or my workplace. If they breached the perimeter of my life, the funds would terminate automatically. They signed the paperwork within the hour, their signatures shaky and defeated. It was an act of clinical mercy, a calculated provision to keep them off the streets. It was not a restoration of affection. You cannot rebuild a bridge that lacked structural integrity from the moment it was engineered. Nia charted a vastly different trajectory. The Internal Revenue Service maintains a robust whistleblower program rewarding individuals who provide actionable intelligence leading to the recovery of stolen federal taxes. By handing over Julian's offshore ledgers, Nia triggered a substantial recovery operation. The government compensated her with a highly lucrative percentage of the seized funds. She did not use the capital to retreat into hiding. She leveraged her reclaimed autonomy to build an empire of her own. Nia opened an independent financial consulting firm in the heart of the business district. Her agency specialized in forensic auditing and asset protection for women navigating high-net-worth divorces. She transformed her traumatic experience into a weapon for justice, securing a brilliant, self-sustaining future for herself and her children. The former auditor had awakened, reigning supreme over her own narrative. My routine returned to a state of focused equilibrium. I resumed my position at the Department of Defense. The security clearance protocols required a brief administrative review following the public incident at the awards gala, but my superiors recognized the tactical precision of the operation. Admiral Thomas commended the extraction of the hostile code and the neutralization of a domestic threat vector. I stepped back into the shadows of the intelligence sector, designing counter-espionage frameworks and managing security projects valued in the billions. I walked the corridors of the Pentagon wearing plain suits, bypassing the loud, performative politicians who sought constant attention. I preferred the silence. The entire orchestration of Julian's downfall relied on a fundamental psychological principle. He equated volume with influence. He believed that flashing an expensive watch or shouting across a velvet rope solidified his dominance. He viewed my quiet demeanor as submission, interpreting my lack of boasting as evidence of failure. He spent his entire life trying to prove he was the smartest man in the room by ensuring everyone else felt inferior. I never needed to scream to validate my worth. I did not have to flaunt bank statements or demand a seat at the head of the table to prove I belonged. The most spectacular element of the reversal was the absence of a screaming match. I simply stepped aside and allowed Julian's unchecked arrogance to dig a grave deep enough to bury his entire fabricated existence. I provided the rope. He eagerly tied the knot. True power operates on a different frequency. It does not require a stage. It does not demand an audience or a round of applause. It is the ability to walk into a room, assess the vulnerabilities of your adversaries, and dismantle their infrastructure without leaving a fingerprint. It is silent. It observes. It waits for the precise moment when the target feels most invincible. And when that exact second arrives, it delivers a fatal, calculated strike, ensuring that those who spent their lives underestimating you never get the opportunity to stand back up. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the Potomac River reflect the fading light of the Capitol. The storm I orchestrated has long since passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet reality. The dust has settled over Julian's ruined empire and our parents' isolated suburban exile. Looking back at the wreckage of their own making, the architecture of this entire conflict offers a blueprint for survival. If you ever find yourself trapped in a dynamic where your worth is constantly diminished, there are 3 structural truths you must internalize. The first lesson is that silence is a tactical advantage, not a symptom of weakness. For decades, my brother equated my quiet demeanor with surrender. He mistook my refusal to brag as a lack of achievement. Arrogant individuals thrive on noise and reaction. When you refuse to engage in their theatrical shouting matches, you deny them the friction they need to operate. Never interrupt an opponent who is actively constructing their own downfall. Keep your mouth shut, gather your data, and let their unchecked ego blind them to the trap you are setting. The second truth dismantles the societal myth of unconditional family loyalty. We are conditioned to believe that sharing genetics mandates a lifetime of sacrifice. My parents utilized this expectation to enable a predator while demanding I fund their compliance. Biology does not entitle anyone to your resources, your peace of mind, or your future. Setting rigid, unforgiving boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is a fundamental requirement for self-preservation. You owe nothing to people who only remember your name when their golden child stops paying the bills. The final lesson concerns the actual nature of power. Julian spent his life chasing gold-embossed VIP passes, charity gala spotlights, and country club memberships. He built a fortress of fragile validation. Real influence does not require a stage. It does not demand applause or a seat at the head of a mahogany table. True power is the ability to assess a hostile environment, identify the structural vulnerabilities, and execute a decisive strike without leaving a fingerprint. You do not need to prove your success to those who are determined to see you fail. You only need to deliver the results. You hold the pen that writes your narrative. Do not let loud, insecure people dictate your value. If my journey resonated with you, or if you have ever had to quietly dismantle the toxic structures in your own life, drop a comment below and share your experience. I read every single one. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about stepping out of the shadows and reclaiming your power. Thank you for listening, and remember to always let your execution speak louder than their words.